On a freezing Christmas Eve, a single mother working late at a diner discovers two small twin boys huddled beside a trash bin in a dark alley, shivering under torn blankets with no parents in sight. And what she decides to do next will change not only their lives but also restore your faith in humanity. Because sometimes the greatest miracles happen when one person chooses love over convenience and opens their heart to strangers who need it most. So stay with me until the end, because this story will move you in ways you never expected. Emma Carter wiped down the last table at the diner with a tired sigh, as the clock on the wall showed 11:30 on Christmas Eve, and the exhaustion in her bones felt heavier than usual after working a double shift to earn enough money for her 7-year-old son's Christmas present, which was now wrapped in cheap, colorful paper, tucked safely in her worn canvas bag. And as she hung up her apron and said goodbye to the cook who was locking up the kitchen, she stepped out into the bitterly cold night where snowflakes drifted down from the dark sky, and the streets were nearly empty except for a few last-minute shoppers hurrying home with their arms full of gifts. And she pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, wishing she could afford something warmer, but knowing that every dollar counted when you were raising a child alone on a waitress salary. And she started walking toward the bus stop 3 blocks away with her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air, and the only sounds were her footsteps crunching on the icy sidewalk and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. And she was thinking about how her son Tommy would react tomorrow morning when he opened his present, which was a small remote control car that she had saved up for over 3 months. And she smiled to herself despite her tiredness, because seeing his face light up would make every long shift and sore foot worth it. And as she turned the corner past a row of closed shops with dark windows, she noticed something unusual. Near the mouth of a narrow alley, where a single flickering streetlight cast strange shadows on the brick walls. And at first she thought it was just a pile of old boxes or discarded furniture. But then she saw movement, and her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was 2 small figures huddled together under what looked like dirty blankets beside a large trash bin. And she stopped walking and stared, because surely those could not be children out here alone on a night this cold. And she took a few cautious steps closer, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw 2 little boys who could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old, with pale faces and wide, frightened eyes peering out from beneath the torn fabric they were using to keep warm. And they were dressed in clothes that were far too thin for winter weather, and their small hands were red and raw from the cold. And Emma felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces as she rushed forward without thinking, and knelt down beside them, ignoring the dirty snow soaking through her jeans. And she said in the gentlest voice she could manage, "Hello, sweethearts. What are you doing out here all alone?" And the boys flinched and pressed closer together like scared animals, and the one on the left, who had darker hair and a small scar above his eyebrow, whispered, "Please don't hurt us." And Emma felt tears spring to her eyes, and she shook her head quickly and said, "Oh, no, I would never hurt you. I just want to help you." And she reached out slowly and touched the blanket, which was damp and freezing, and she said, "Where are your parents?" And the other boy, who looked almost identical to his brother, except for a tiny mole on his cheek, said in a small, trembling voice, "Our mama will come back soon." And Emma felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather, because something about the way he said it made her think that their mother was not coming back at all. And she said, "How long have you been out here?" And the boys looked at each other. And then the first one said, "We don't know." And Emma saw that their lips were turning blue, and their shivering was becoming more violent, and she knew she could not leave them here for even another minute, or they might not survive the night. And she said, "Listen, I live close by, and it is warm there, and I have food. Would you like to come with me just for tonight until we can find your mama?" And the boys hesitated and looked at each other again with uncertainty in their young eyes, and Emma understood their fear because they had probably been taught not to go with strangers, but she also saw the desperation in their faces, and finally the darker-haired boy nodded slowly, and Emma felt relief wash over her, and she stood up and held out her hands and said, "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." And the boys took her hands with their small frozen fingers, and she helped them to their feet and noticed how thin and weak they were, as if they had not eaten properly in days. And she led them down the street toward her apartment building, which was only 4 blocks away, but felt like miles as she walked slowly to match their stumbling steps, and tried to keep them warm by wrapping her own coat around their shoulders, even though it left her shivering in just her uniform shirt. And when they finally reached her building, She fumbled with her keys and unlocked the door to her small ground-floor apartment and ushered the boys inside where the warmth from the heater immediately wrapped around them, and she quickly turned on all the lights and locked the door behind them and said, "Okay, first things first, let's get you warmed up." And she led them to the small bathroom and ran warm water over their hands and faces while they stood silently watching her with cautious eyes, and she dried them gently with soft towels, and then brought them to the living room where she turned on the space heater and said, "Now, let me make you something to eat." And she went to the kitchen, which was really just a corner of the main room separated by a counter, and she heated up leftover soup and made grilled cheese sandwiches and brought the food to the boys who were sitting close together on the old couch. And when she placed the plates in front of them, their eyes went wide, and they fell on the food like they had not eaten in weeks, and Emma had to stop herself from crying as she watched them devour every bite. And she sat down across from them and waited until they had finished eating before she said softly, "Can you tell me your names?" And the darker-haired boy said, "I am Daniel and this is David and we are twins." And Emma smiled and said, "I thought so, you look exactly alike." And then she said, "And your mama, where is she?" And the boys' faces fell. And Daniel said she had an accident, and David added she went to sleep and did not wake up. And Emma felt her heart shatter because now she understood, and she said, "When did this happen?" And Daniel said, "We don't know." And David said, "We were staying with a lady, but she said she could not keep us and told us to wait outside and she would come back, but she never did." And Emma felt anger rise in her chest at the thought of someone abandoning these helpless children, but she pushed it down and said, "How long have you been outside?" And Daniel shrugged and said, "Maybe 3 days." And Emma gasped and said, "3 days, and you have been sleeping in that alley?" And Daniel nodded and said, "We tried to stay warm and we found food in the trash sometimes." And Emma covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a sob, and then she took a deep breath and said, "Okay, well, you are safe now, and tomorrow we will figure out what to do. But tonight you are going to sleep in a warm bed." And she stood up and went to her son's room where Tommy was sleeping peacefully in his small bed with his favorite stuffed bear. And she quietly gathered some extra blankets and pillows and brought them to the living room and made a comfortable sleeping area on the floor near the heater. And she said, "You can sleep here, and if you need anything, I will be right in the next room." And the boys nodded and climbed under the blankets, and Emma tucked them in and said goodnight. And as she turned off the main light, leaving only a small lamp on, she heard Daniel whisper, "Thank you." And she smiled and said, "You are very welcome." And then she went to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed and let the tears flow freely, because she could not believe that 2 innocent children had been living on the streets with no one to care for them. And she thought about her own son sleeping safely just a few feet away and felt overwhelming gratitude mixed with guilt that she had so much when others had nothing. And she wiped her eyes and pulled out her phone and looked up the number for Child Protective Services, but when she saw that they were closed until after Christmas, she felt frustrated and decided she would call first thing in the morning. And for now, she would just make sure the boys were safe and warm and fed, and she changed into her pajamas and lay down on her bed. But sleep would not come because her mind was racing with questions about what would happen to Daniel and David, and whether they had any family who could take them in, and whether the system would separate them or keep them together. And she tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion won, and she drifted into a restless sleep. And when she woke up a few hours later to the sound of her alarm, it was Christmas morning, and she quickly got up and checked on the twins who were still sleeping peacefully under the blankets. And she smiled, and then went to wake up her son Tommy, who rubbed his eyes, and said, "Is it Christmas?" And she said, "Yes, it is." And he jumped out of bed and ran toward the living room, but stopped short when he saw the 2 strange boys sleeping on the floor. And he turned to his mother with wide, confused eyes, and Emma knelt down beside him and whispered, "These are Daniel and David, and they needed a place to stay, so they are going to spend Christmas with us." And Tommy looked at the boys and then back at his mother, and said, "Okay." And Emma was proud of how easily he accepted the situation, and she said, "Now let's let them sleep a little longer, and you can open your present." And Tommy's face lit up, and he ran to the small Christmas tree in the corner where his one wrapped gift was waiting, and he tore off the paper and gasped with delight when he saw the remote control car. And Emma smiled and said quietly, "So you don't wake the boys." And Tommy nodded and took his new toy to his room to play. And about an hour later, Daniel and David woke up and looked around confused, as if they had forgotten where they were. And then they saw Emma in the kitchen making breakfast, and they slowly sat up, and Emma said, "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" And they nodded, and she said, "Come and eat." And she served them pancakes with syrup, and they ate with the same hunger as the night before. And then Tommy came out of his room with his new car and showed it to the twins and said, "Do you want to play?" And Daniel and David looked at Emma as if asking permission. And she nodded and said of course, and soon all three boys were on the floor racing the little car around and laughing. And Emma watched them with a warm feeling in her chest and thought about how strange it was that just 12 hours ago she had not known these children existed, and now they were playing with her son in her living room on Christmas morning. And after they played for a while, Emma said, "Okay, boys, I need to make some phone calls." And she went into her bedroom and called Child Protective Services and explained the situation, and the woman on the other end said they would send someone out after the holiday to assess the situation. And Emma asked what would happen to the boys, and the woman said they would likely be placed in foster care, and Emma felt her stomach drop because she had heard stories about the foster system and how children sometimes got lost in it or moved from home to home, and she asked if there was any way to find their family, and the woman said they would do a search, but it could take time. And Emma thanked her and hung up and sat on her bed feeling overwhelmed, and then she heard laughter from the living room, and she went back out and saw the three boys building a tower with some old blocks she had saved from when Tommy was younger. And she watched them for a moment and realized that Daniel and David looked happier than they had since she found them. And she thought about how Tommy had always wanted a sibling, and how natural it felt to have them here. And suddenly an idea formed in her mind that was so crazy and impulsive that she almost dismissed it immediately. But the more she thought about it, the more right it felt. And she spent the rest of Christmas Day cooking a simple meal and playing games with the boys and watching them smile and laugh and bond with each other. And that night, after she put all three boys to bed, she sat alone in the living room and looked up information about emergency foster care and adoption, and she read story after story about children who needed homes and families who had opened their hearts to strangers. And she thought about her own life and how hard she worked just to make ends meet, and how adding 2 more children would make everything even harder. But she also thought about how empty her life had felt sometimes being alone except for Tommy, and how much love she had to give, and how these 2 little boys had already started to feel like part of her family. And by the time she went to bed that night, she had made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. And the next morning when the social worker arrived, Emma had already prepared what she was going to say, and when the woman whose name was Mrs. Rodriguez walked in and started asking questions about how Emma had found the boys and what condition they were in, Emma answered everything honestly. And then she took a deep breath and said, "I want to become their foster parent." And Mrs. Rodriguez looked surprised and said, "That is very kind of you, but you should know that fostering is a big responsibility and there is a lot of paperwork and home inspections." And Emma said, "I understand, and I know it won't be easy, but these boys have already been through so much, and I don't want them to be moved around to different homes." And Mrs. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment and then said, "Let me do some background checks and we will see what we can do." And over the next few weeks, Emma filled out endless forms and had her apartment inspected and went through interviews and background checks, and the whole time, Daniel and David stayed with her in a temporary arrangement, and slowly they began to open up and talk more. And she learned that their mother had been a young single woman like herself who had been killed in a car accident, and that they had no other family that anyone could find. And she learned that Daniel loved to draw, and David loved to sing, and that both of them had nightmares almost every night and would wake up crying and calling for their mama, and Emma would go to them and hold them and rock them back to sleep and tell them that everything would be okay. And slowly the nightmares became less frequent, and the smiles became more common. And Tommy welcomed them like the brothers he had always wanted and shared his toys in his room without complaint. And Emma watched her little family grow and change, and felt a sense of purpose and joy that she had never experienced before. And finally, after what felt like forever, Mrs. Rodriguez came back with the news that Emma had been approved as a temporary foster parent, and that if things went well, she could eventually adopt the twins. And Emma cried with relief and happiness, and hugged the boys and told them that they were going to stay together, and Daniel and David looked at her with tears in their own eyes. And David said, "Forever." And Emma said, "Yes, forever." And Daniel said, "You want to be our mama," and Emma felt her heart overflow with love, and she said, "If you want me to be," and both boys threw their arms around her and said yes. And that night Emma tucked all three boys into bed because she had bought bunk beds so they could all share Tommy's room, and she kissed each of their foreheads and said, "Good night, my sons." And as she turned out the light, she heard Tommy whisper to the twins, "I am glad you came to live with us," and Daniel whispered back, "We are glad too." And Emma stood in the hallway with tears streaming down her face because she realized that what had seemed like the worst Christmas Eve of her life, when she was exhausted and broke and lonely, had actually been the beginning of the greatest blessing she had ever received. And she thought about how easy it would have been to walk past that alley and assume someone else would help those boys, and how different all of their lives would be now if she had made that choice. And she understood that family was not about blood or biology, but about showing up and choosing love even when it was hard. And she went to her room and lay down in her bed and felt more grateful than she had ever felt in her entire life, because she had been given the chance to make a difference. And in the process, she had gained so much more than she had given. And as she drifted off to sleep, she smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and struggles, because raising three boys on a waitress salary would not be easy. But it would be worth it because they would face those challenges together as a family. And she knew that years from now, when Daniel and David were grown, they would remember this Christmas as the time their lives changed forever. And they would remember that someone cared enough to stop and help when they needed it most, and maybe they would pass that lesson on to others and create a ripple effect of kindness and compassion that would reach far beyond what Emma could ever imagine. And in the end, that was what mattered most, not the money or the gifts or the big celebrations, but the simple act of opening your heart to someone who needs it, and choosing love over fear and family over loneliness. And as Emma finally fell asleep, she knew that she had made the right choice and that her life would never be the same, and she was grateful for every moment of it.